welcome to our conversation today on Towards a Transformative Political Economy. This is our second session in the webinar series called Reimagining the Future, People's Agenda for a Post-COVID Economy. And this is part of a larger process to initiate debates on alternative economies, and also at the same time looking at what kind of initiating and supporting actions to address immediate needs of people, especially those who are most vulnerable and put at risk. Now, this webinar series is co-sponsored by many social movements and civil society organizations. So by way of introduction of this, I was asked to make a few introductory remarks, and I'll just spend a couple of minutes on that. We are in the midst of a unique crisis where a number of forces, pressures are converging all at the same time. So, of course, at the center, we have the disease itself, COVID-19, which is caused by a highly infectious pathogen, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Not much apparently is known about this virus, or so we hear, or so we read. But at the same time, we also are subject to many competing and conflicting narratives about the virus itself, the origin of the virus, the origin of the disease, and also how to contain and manage the disease. So that's at the center. But at the same time, we also have government and societal responses to the pandemic, whose impacts are going to definitely they're going to outlast the actual pandemic. And the impacts that people feel that are being felt by different communities and social groups across India and indeed across the world, of course, these are also not happening in isolation. These impacts are exacerbated by pre-existing conditions of inequality, of social class, prejudice, and so on. Then we have a deepening climate crisis, because just because there's a pandemic, the climate crisis is not going to go away. And in fact, now we are about to face a huge cyclone of the Bay of Bengal, which is going to really devastate parts of many coastal lines of India, also Burma and Bangladesh. We have a continuing expansion of global capitalism into new areas of extractive economies. For example, the digital economy, data, nature, living beings, and so on. But of course, I'm sure some of you will touch on that. We have the rise of extreme authoritarian and fascist forces, which is happening not only just in India, but across Asia and indeed across the world. This is a serious issue since the last 5-6 years. And if we just look at the relationship between fascism, authoritarianism, and handling the COVID crisis, across Asia, we're seeing states of emergency and emergency powers that governments have adopted. Whether they call it the Disaster Management Act or they call it a national health emergency and so on. And there are some very, alarming commonalities across what governments are doing in terms of increased restrictions on speech, assembly, association, targeting certain communities, holding them responsible for the pandemic, and so on. So we are faced now with, on one hand, with addressing immediate concerns and dealing with the crisis and the impacts of the crisis as it unfolds every day and every week. And at the same time, this thought that, is this an opportunity? Can we seize this opportunity to push very strongly for progressive structural transformations, for structural progress, for progressive systemic changes? Is this not a time when we can say, business as usual in the past cannot continue? The new normal of COVID cannot be the old normal. It anyway will not be the same normal situation as before. But what is it that we who are committed to progressive social, political, economic, environmental change and transformation, what is it that we can do to try to move from a extremely destructive context and paradigm that we were in towards something that's humane, just, spiritual, compassionate, and that politically, economically, and socially makes sense. So to discuss these, I'm very honored to be in conversation with four very eminent activists and speakers for change: Medha Patkar, Mr. Devasahayam, Aseem Shrivastava, and Ashish Kothari. I will introduce each one of them right now before we start the conversation. Our first speaker will be Medha Patkar. And Medha Patkar is one of the best known Indian activists for people's rights. She is the founder of the Narmada Bachao Andolan. She's the co-founder and one of the national conveners of the National Alliance of People's Movements. She's a leading organizer of the Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao Andolan for people's rights to housing. She's a trade unionist who has been working with mill workers' rights and engaged with them to take over and run mills. She's the recipient of numerous international awards for her work as a human rights defender, as a political campaigner, and for upholding environmental and social rights. Medha works with urban and rural communities, Adivasis, who are indigenous peoples, workers, communities negatively affected by large dams and infrastructure projects, and those who are politically, socially, and economically persecuted. Since the COVID crisis began, Medha Patkar has been working in support of workers who have been ruthlessly stranded by the lockdowns and by the obvious preference that the central government and many state governments have demonstrated. You know, the preference towards builders and large capital over workers and local enterprises. Our second speaker is going to be Mr. M.G. Devasahayam. And Mr. Devasahayam is he says very humbly that he's a student of economics who has exposure to army, civil service, corporate, and voluntary sectors. But he's also an eminent writer, has co-authored books on the emergency, on Mother Teresa, on the late Jayaprakash Narayan. He's a prolific writer. He has contributed to several op-eds, lead articles, and columns in many newspapers and magazines on a range of topics, including governance, civil services, urban development, environment, and politics. He was closely associated with the leader of the anti-emergency movement, the late J.P. Narayan, and also with Mother Teresa. And some of the books that he has authored include India's Second Freedom, An Untold Saga, JP in Jail, An Uncensored Account, JP Movement, Emergency and India's Second Freedom, and A Drop of Love, Memoirs of Saint Teresa. Our third speaker is going to be Aseem Shrivastava. Aseem Shrivastava is the author with Ashish Kothari of Churning the Earth, The Making of Global India, which was published in 2012 by Penguin Viking in New Delhi. This is a book which critically assesses the development strategy of successive Indian governments since 1947 and proceeds to propose a different path, which is not only equitable and just, but also ecologically sound and renewable. In Hindi, this book exists as Prithvi Manthan, and it was published in 2016 by Raj Kamal in New Delhi. Mr. Shrivastava teaches ecosophy at Ashoka University, and he has been working on a long study of the relevance of Rabindranath Tagore's vision to the ecological survival and imperative of the present-day world. Our fourth speaker is Ashish Kothari. Also, Ashish Kothari is an environmentalist who has been associated with a number of people's movements and environmental movements. He's the founder of Kalpavriksh, which works on environment and development issues. He has coordinated India's national biodiversity strategy and action plan process. He has served on Greenpeace's international and India boards. He has chaired an IUCN network dealing with protected areas and communities. Ashish Kothari coordinates the Vikalp Sangam, which means alternatives confluence in English. The Vikalp Sangam process provides a forum for organizations and individuals working on development alternatives across India. Ashish Kothari has also authored and co-authored over 30 books and 400 articles on India's environments, birds, and biodiversity, and so on. So it is an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with these four eminent speakers and activists. So let's start right away. The first speaker will be Medha. My request to all speakers is please speak for 15 minutes first. And then we can have all the speakers speak, and then we can take questions. And as I've already requested the participants, please listen to the speaker, and then send in your question identifying which speaker you would like to direct your question to. Okay, so Medha, please, you are first.
Sorry, I'm not techno-savvy at all, and hence it may create some problems. I will try and restrict myself to 15 minutes, and hence I will have to go fast and take some issues very tangentially, but we'll deal with those during question answer. You see, the topic is very, very relevant to the today's situation when we are not locked down that way, but still we are compelled to take to certain new initiatives and new dimensions, not only for discussion and debate, but towards changing our own lifestyles and bringing in new visions. So the political economy is the study of production and trade and their relations with law, custom, and government, and with the distribution of national income and wealth. Now, this being the context of today's theme, I would say that these are exactly the issues, the political economic issues, which have arisen in the present context, when the huge population of the migrant workers and those who are not migrated but are locked down and unemployed or underemployed, they are not just on the streets but on the drawing board, maybe for the first time in that to that extent. Hence, the major issue that is really being exposed is that of inequity. When the Constitution is clearly for equity and justice, right from the preamble to the directive principles, deciding exactly in the opposite direction. The producers who are not traders, who are the primary contributors, who really contribute their human power, and if they have the natural resources around, and also their skills, and hence the primary sector is really cracked down upon, and that is what is now coming to the fore. So the new economy should give primacy to the real producers, the real creators, and not those who are the investors only of money and the market technologies. The secondary and tertiary sector, and especially the tertiary one, is now over capturing every sector in our economy, polity, and also society. Our digitalization is a part of that. I'm really unfortunate to find that we all are, and we are all compromising on our own ideals and the choices of technologies. We therefore would like to have an alternative economy which will be, first of all, equitable, which only can be sustainable. The sustainability, we cannot attain sustainability and cannot deal with the climate crisis at all. So I think when on the health, for example, only 2.8% of India's budget is spent upon, or in education, we are only 3 to 6%. We are not guaranteeing the social security and economic security to this class of our citizens, our voter citizens, which we should be first focusing on, and for which we need to have the wage limits. We should have Amiri Rekha, not just Garibi Rekha, which is really insulting to those who are really contributing the most and not becoming the beneficiaries of the same, leave aside the sharers in the profit. So they are the least respected stakeholders. And hence we need to really have not just the percentage of budget increased, but equity in budget distribution, where the most deprived and destitutionalized classes with the principle of Antyodaya, bringing the Gandhiji in the new relevance, must get the first priority also, not just the primacy. And we should have them through the positive discrimination, which is there in the constitution, but the laws are not implemented due to many reasons. For example, the privatization is out of that statutory sector, public sector, where there is no positive discrimination in favor of Dalits and Adivasis, so on and so forth. We should not have 1 to 10, more than 1 to 10 differences in the wage and profit, both. And we must have the highest possible wealth tax in this country. Even if we raise that with certain percentage, not only for COVID-19, but all through, we will have a tax-free India in all other sectors and all other incomes. And this is what has been calculated. 125 lakh crores of tax is possible to be raised through increase in wealth tax. And that's why I'm saying that Amiri Rekha, Sampatti Rekha is a must. And for that now to change towards that from the present times, we need freedom from debt. The slate should be plain and available for the new designs and the new taxation rules and regulations. For this, again, to be sustained, we need not just decentralization, as if PM Cares Fund will be huge and then that will be distributed to the states. No, we don't want that. We want a centralization, and a centralization will be not less than anything less than localization. So local, vocal for local with global context, these kinds of fake paradigms we should reject, and we should have really localization, which will be like a communitocracy. Democracy with the 4 pillars that are known to everyone, I will not repeat, really leaves out demos, the people, which should not be the 5th pillar, but the first pillar of our overall decision-making processes, social, political, and economic. And that's why I'm saying it should be localization, should be communitocracy, which will be based on a face-to-face communication, least mechanization, least monetization, least marketization, and least mediation. All these bichauliye, intermediaries who are looting, this time the farmers are facing the crisis because they had huge produce, not just maize and wheat, but also the fruits and vegetables. And those could not reach the really needy, hunger-stricken and malnourished sections of our population because of the profit-making which is. And now the mandis are also going to be privatized. We must oppose this. We should really build the new institutions based on Article 243 of our Constitution, where the bottom-up decision-making process is really very well spelled out, and that can be further spelled out. And the trusteeship idea of Mahatma Gandhi is also necessary, because Dalits within the community, women within the community, they should not be sections who would still face deprivation in spite of communitization or localization. Hence, I think the institutions should be dealt with. The Forest Rights Act, the Employment Guarantee Act has some seeds towards that, but I think we will have to go beyond that also. Now, the politics and economics linkage is my third point. Now, this is really creating a havoc in this country. We are not against industrialization per se, but corporatization is different from industrialization. And the corporate government linkage is really violating or bypassing the no office of profit principle, which is very clearly stated in our books of laws. And that is through the builders, politicians, or the kith and kins of the politicians, whether it is the son of this leader or that leader, they are engaged with the builders, the big corporates in every sector, and everything they are making as a business. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, very perfect,
So
Medha.
I
Please
think
continue.
education is business, health is business because of this kind of privatization, which is corporatization. The Maharshi Karve's educational institutions were also private institutions, but Jugat Ramdave's institutions were private institutions, but that was not privatization, that was socialization. And beyond that, some nationalization is also needed. Nationalization of banks is going the other way around because everywhere these private players are sticking to profit over people, as Noam Chomsky called it. So I think this needs to change. Now the import-export based economy, that is also really killing our own market mechanisms. We are not saying there should be no exchange, there should be no market, and there should only be barter economy. But the kind of rules and regulations that are brought in, or kind of projects that are brought in, are really based on more on import export than on self-reliance, if not self-sufficiency. So that principle of Gandhiji's ideology is a must, and that was also reflected partly in Ambedkarite ideology, because I always refer to the Mahad Satyagraha, because after saying that the Dalits should leave and come to the cities, he finally went to also asserting their rights to the local water resource, water body. Now that he would have taken much further if he was alive today. So I think the Gandhi, Ambedkar, Marx, Phule can be brought together to really work out the self-reliant economy within which there should be equity, justice, and sustainability as a principle. How much of import we are today living on, many people do not know, but Nitin Gadkari made it clear in one of his speeches that we have 80% of edible oil seeds imported. We have 7 lakh crore of import of crude oil. We have 5 lakh crore of import of electronics. That goes sometimes to 25 lakh crores. And we have the newspaper machinery also imported, so on and so forth. I think unless we give up not just the Chinese products, but also the American products, and stick to the idea of primacy to the products and the technologies that are Swadeshi or Desi, because Swadeshi ko bhi ek alang rang diya gaya tha. We want a Desi. And now this is the time when the workers have returned back with huge pain, agony, exploitation, because they are not even paid the due salaries and wages, and also insult that they have faced by the country as a whole. I must say, we all must own the responsibility, because we are talking a lot, but we are not stopping them from walking. We are not putting them on the trucks and trains. And even till yesterday, almost midnight, when we were watching what is happening outside the railway station, it is really very, very painful. But still, the government of Maharashtra kind of governments are somewhat responding. The government of Bengal is largely targeted deliberately. So this is the politics of even the present times. Leave that aside. But when they are returning back, the Manarega, the employment guarantee scheme, is a must. But that is an intermediate measure. That can be considered as not only welfare, the rightful measure, but still it cannot be that 100 days they get employment or the source of livelihood, and then the rest 265 days are to face lockdown. We must therefore deal with the technologies which are handmade, least mechanized, more labor intensive, all that everyone knows, but those will be human made technologies and creations, and that will also bring in humanitarian ideals reflected in the power relations, which are not seen between the Gujarat farmers and the Adivasi laborers from Maharashtra, Nandurbar, or Madhya Pradesh, who faced hell when they had to return back. And even today, when the Karnataka builders stop them, or the other factory owners now decide to stop them without feeding them all these days during lockdown, we know that these are the power relations which we must change. And if we really go to these kinds of bottom-up decision-making processes, which are possible only with the community as the first unit of primacy, then certainly there will be no change in laws, because the laws will also come up from the bottom up. many things. And say Schedule 11 of the Constitution, for example, will be in the hands of the rural communities or in the hands of the urban muhallas, and that will really be against the present knockdown on the laws, because all the laws which are based on presuming the centralized economy and politics, but granting some benefits, some spaces, some rights, and the shares to the other stakeholders like these workers. We will not accept that. We want that the laws should be further pro people and not anti people. So the change in the labor legislation, change in the environmental laws, all this we will have to cry halt to, and really say that the already evolved laws, but basically the constitution should get reflected in every decision making process, even at the community level. But obviously the change in the relationship between nature and human beings and living beings also will change. Is the lockdown, it is said, has made the rivers flow freely and the rivers flow purely, but that has not happened overall, because the economic dimensions are not changed. The thermal power and the big dams are still on. So we will have to work out primacy and in sequence the priorities to certain technologies. In power, the solar, the tidal wave, the human power, and so on, against the hydropower through big hydro or the thermal power. And for that also, if we have the rights to the local communities, there will be a stoppage, but not full stoppage. There will be the criteria and conditions for exchange of, not acquisition of, exchange of resources. And that will change the technology, I'm sure. So I think we should really turn the present situation around and really have also the land use pattern changed. The agriculture, as I said, basic fulfillment of basic needs. If that is the priority, obviously food is the first need. And it was because that was not guaranteed even through the PDS system, which is really very weak in many ways. There is not just corruption, but there also is the manipulation of the amount of food needed per capita, that is also wrongly calculated, so on and so forth. And it is not universalized, so we must have universalization of these basic things and not of the consumerist products. So I think that also deals with the customs. Our customs have two aspects. One is full of Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb of the national unity and so on, and the community as the basis, with the economy of the various kind of producers, and that is very essential to be retained. But the other side, caste, religion, gender, region coming in the way as a divisive and discriminatory force, must be stopped. Now that has everything as a framework in the constitution, but state-run public sector to retain these kinds of certain production processes, because corporates will never follow the constitution. They are anti-constitutional in mostly. So the small industries, the home industries, the village industries can have the constitutional framework reflected. Now coming to the last 2 points, the judiciary, which is the pillar of democracy, no doubt. But as I said, people should be the first pillar of democracy, and the judiciary then can be the third or the fourth pillar of democracy. But if the judiciary is also not independent today, who will decide as to what offense should be punished and caught hold of and try to be changed? So that is not working, even with the government appointment of judges or the collegium system. And hence, I think unless the society is not just transparent, but feels accountable, and make them feel accountable with the transparency and accountability in judicial system, that is what is Prashant Bhushan and others are pushing. We cannot achieve through judiciary what we want to achieve in the situation of violations. So I think the judiciary also must take into consideration the gender justice, farmer justice, labor justice, and for that the society must become aware. The digitalization of India kind of change is bringing out transparency maybe, and a huge block of data, even serendipitous data, but and we are happy with it. But that is inflation of data and documents, but that is not transparency with accountability. That is without accountability, and that's why fake news and everything. So when these are the main media, we must go to the alternative media also. I will not take more time on that, but only on the last point, that the vote bank politics, that also needs to be changed if we have to change political economy, because that is really using funds, money making, money lending business. And that's why there is less representation and more repression through that system. That is not just changing our institutions, but changing the whole democratic processes and values. And hence, I think we must change that. I have a number of points for changing this present electoral system, but I will not take more time. I think I will only say that all this cannot be achieved unless we are in struggle and reconstruction, which has been always our point, because we need to save green cover, we need to save our rivers, we need to really bring in a new lifestyle while relating with nature and also relating with the other human beings. And for that, movements also cannot be only on the streets through rallies and dharnas. We have done it enough, but now there is no space granted. We must have not just webinars to show the change that we are accommodating and adjusting to, but we must have the change after lockdown at least, which will have to be ending sometime or other, and sooner if not later. And we must really have the mass strength expressed and reflected and brought out in every of these aspects. Then only we can be saving ourselves, not only through coronavirus, but also through the climate crisis. Otherwise, the 2% temperature rise cannot be stopped, because unless the lifestyle changes, the relations changes, and the nature is saved, we cannot save ourselves. So don't get locked down. On the other hand, be students of Gandhi, Ambedkar, Marx, Phule, Periyar, Jayaprakash, Vinoba, Lohia. They are the ones who have brought out all these alternative frameworks, and bringing them together will really create a new alternative vision, and also the operationalization of that vision into sectoral alternatives. And we can challenge this monstrous, attacking, destroying, and destitutionalizing economy and polity both.
Thank you very much, Medha. Thank you. Many crucial points have been raised as expected. I will not summarize any of them. Let's go directly to the next speaker, to Mr. M.G. Devasahayam. Please, sir, the floor is yours.
I'll be very specific. I will not go into any generalities. To start with, what is the political system today? Today's political system, in the past 5-6 years, is not what the original Indian political system was, which is basically democracy, freedom, liberty. The political system has morphed into an autocratic system. Let us understand that first. And then, what is today's economy? It is not the original economy, which was brought in by the founding fathers, the sui generis economy. It is a predatory economy. Even the last 3, 4, 5 days, this lady Nirmala Sitharaman has been coming out with so-called stimulus package, purely predatory. It has nothing to do with the original economy that was conceived for this country. So, first of all, I will touch upon, because of this, governance in this country has almost completely collapsed. Because I have been a practicing administrator, the way we look at the governance today in every sphere, governance has come to its nadir. That has led to one disaster, the pandemic disaster, multiplying into 5. On 24th March, when the countrywide lockdown was announced, we had about 600 cases of COVID. Now it has crossed 1 lakh. But in the meantime, in the last nearly 2 months, this disaster has spread into multiple. Life disaster continues. Threat to life continues. COVID continues, and it is spreading. It is expanding. But the disaster, livelihood disaster, is tearing us in a very cruel manner. And disaster, liberty, to our liberty, individual freedom and liberty, is at a serious threat. Then dignity. Liberty and dignity are built into the preamble of the Constitution. Without dignity, there is no human being. Life is meaningless without liberty. And finally, the economy itself is facing a massive disaster. So under these circumstances, what do we do? Because in the last 5-6 years, more so after the disaster, the government of India has been completely ignoring the fundamental concepts of governance. What is a fundamental concept of governance? Government is different from governance. Government is only part of governance. Governance should be a joint venture between the government, the business, agriculture, that means wealth creators, and the civil society, who are the conscience keepers. Now, even during the last 5-6 years, this government has been completely ignoring the other two. And now, after this lockdown, which in view is not actually pandemic lockdown, I've written a lot about it. It is curfew. It is riot-induced curfew. People were treated as enemies. People were treated as unlawful assembly. And result, what we find today, there is total lack of faith. The migration, the massive migration of millions and millions are because of this totally wrong governance, which has created a tremendous amount of divide. Now, having said that, now where do we go from here? The present kind of political system, the present system of autocracy, and present system of predatory development just cannot work. That is why I am of the view, the way things have been run, ever since the liberalization era of 1990, early 90s, in the last 30 years particularly, we have created several economies in this country. One economy for the 1% super rich, but 9-10% rich and upper middle class, another economy, another 30% for the middle class. But there is no economy for the 60%. Why do I say that? Let us understand very clearly, in the public domain, it is not truth, which is the truth. Perception is the truth. Actually, it is the 60% of the people who really are the wealth creators. As a matter of fact, the other 40% of the wealth enjoyers. But the things have been distorted in such a manner. Wealth creators are being shown as people who are sort of third-rate citizens. And who are these people? 60% mostly comprising of women who create care. Care economy is, in my view, is the biggest economy. But for the care given by the women, I don't think we will be able to survive as a political entity or economic entity. Then the informal sector, most of the informal sector, who really add value to everything, from household to the big factories. Then who else? The peasant farmer. Then the other vulnerable groups. Overall, and today we consider them as only receivers of subsidy, receivers of handouts, receivers of freebies. So they have to be suppressed and repressed. This is this general mindset, which this government is also contributing. Corporates, okay, they are there for making profit. But the government, which is elected by the people, who are there because of the mandate of these very people, 60% of these people. And they also have the same feeling, and it is clearly reflected in the 5-day marathon, so-called stimulus announced just a couple of days ago by the finance minister. Now, How do we repulse this? We got to create an economy for this 60%. What kind of economy? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. It is there when the founding fathers. Two ideas of India they brought to us. They gave it to us through the constitution or otherwise. One is a political idea of India. The political idea of India is grassroots democracy, panchayat raj, democracy rising from below. Panchayats, Gram Parishad, Assembly, Parliament. That was the objective resolution 1946, as well as Mahatma Gandhi's Swarajya and other kind of concepts. This is the political idea of India. Flowing from the political idea of India was the economic idea of India. Based on this grassroots democracy institutions, we will have a sui generis, our own. What was our own at the time of independence and freedom? Our own was basically rural and agricultural economy. That was our own. We should have built that through capital, through investment, through other kind of means, technology interventions. We should have brought in a rural agro economy. Instead, Jawaharlal Nehru sort of went into a kind of tizzy, and then they came up, brought in a mixed economy. Now it has morphed into a complete capitalist, centralized, predatory economy. We have to go back to the roots, political roots and economic roots. How do you do that? Now, it is very easy to say, but in the present governance system, in the present political system, present electoral system, which depends purely on the money collected, money raised. I have done a lot of work on the electoral system. Medha Patkar ji briefly touched upon the electoral system. Today's electoral system is totally corrupt. And the central government is today sitting there with less than 25% of the mandate of the electorate. Less than 25%. Why I am saying that is 31% of the people who voted, it works out to only 25% of the electorate. With 25% mandate of the electorate, they are completely transforming the entire concept of India's democracy and the constitution. And people are being subdued, people are being purchased through money, through liquor, through other means. So today's electoral system is completely corrupt. This is not the democratic electoral system. We have to address this very seriously. On a different platform, we are working on it, but it has to become a people's movement. Because at the end of the day, democracy is not for the politicians, democracy is for the people. Now, from there, where do we go now? Coming back to the economic side. So what I have in mind is, we have been working on it for quite some time. The 60% economy for the people of this country who do not have an economy of their own, who do not have a recognized economy of their own, because all these modern day development is all multinational centered, investment centered, urban centered, massive, and people bear the urban workers. We are talking about migrant workers, all these millions starving in the villages. They go to the cities, and we have now seen they have been functioning as bonded labor, slave labor, and we are now referring to them insultingly as migrants. In our own country, how can they be migrants? They are all Indians. Migrant is a word used only for the foreigners. Recently, we had this Citizenship Act debate. There it was talked about migrant. That is coming from other countries. How can our own boys and girls, our own women, our own men and women, maybe from Bihar, maybe from UP, maybe from other states, how can they be migrants? The very use of word migrant is derisive. So they are our people, but unfortunately, since there has been no development in the rural areas, there is no agro-based development, there is no employment generation, these poor people had to migrate. The word migrate, English, of course, you shift from one place to another, there is migration, but we have to find a new word. They are certainly not migrants. I know I live in Kanyakumari district, southernmost part of India. There are about 10,000-11,000 people who come from other part of India. They are now going back. They are calling them migrants. I will not call them migrants. They are our own citizens. So number one, this is one politically we have to recognize. There are no migrants, all are our citizens. Second, we have to provide for jobs. Today, I being a student of economics, of course, long ago, even now I do little bit of practice. I don't understand this GDP. GDP is a absolutely nonsensical concept for measuring the economy of India. Economy of India to me is only jobs. Creation of jobs at every level. There, I think I appreciate what Medha Patkar said. He talked about the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors of the economy. Primary sector is our strength. The strength of rural India is primary sector. There's agriculture and agro-based industries, agriculture-based. Secondary is manufacturing. Tertiary is service. Now we have gone on to service. Service is dominating now. Come back to the original base. Agro-based, rural-based, small-scale industries. Even in the opening session, Professor Patnaik mentioned about this. But I would like to structure it properly by creating a resource-based, democratic, decentralized, distributed development model. Resource-based means localized, sort of rural, the small, minor, cottage, and homestead industries cannot be big, cannot be multinationals. It has to be small. So it has to be, the resources cannot come from outside the country. Resources cannot come from far away. It has to be based on the local resources to the extent possible. And every area, every district, or every neighboring district, every region has their own resources. Have we ever studied, inventorized these resources, tried to create an economy out of it? No, we have not. We have been only exploiting these resources, exporting them, throwing them in raw form. Our own iron ore, our other kind of minerals, other kind of ores are just being exported in raw form without any value addition. It goes to Japan and comes back from there with millions, value added millions of in steel and in steel. So we have not been able to use our resources for our own developmental growth, and there are big corrupt businessmen who export. These export of these basic minerals and basic resources must stop. We must inventorize our basic resources available in the district or in the region and create an economy based on that. How do we do that? So, number one, improve the productivity of these resources, which are amenable to improvement. Minerals, you can't improve productivity. There is, the volume is already there. But almost all the agricultural, horticultural, animal husbandry, fisheries productivity can substantially increase. Even a small country like Israel with saline water, 5-6 times more than our agriculture and horticulture productivity. I have seen it myself. Number two, all those that agricultural, horticulture, and rural-based things that we produce, raw material, you should add value. Presently, the added value is absolutely dismal. This addition of value alone will substantially engage the rural population with some appropriate skill development. That has not been done at all because we drifted away to MNC-centered FDA, FA, all kind of white-collared investments, completely ignoring. So these resources must be inventorized, and each resource must be identified what kind of value addition it can make. And that value addition must be brought in through household, homestead industries, village, cottage, small industries. Small is beautiful. The concept, Schumacher's concept, small is beautiful, which when introducing me, the madam talked about my associates with Jayaprakash Narayan in the mid-70s. Yes, it was Jayaprakash Narayan who brought Schumacher to India at the request of Madam Gandhi towards the end of the 60s. But she listened to him, spent about a day with him along with the Planning Commission Vice Chairman, but did nothing because overruled by the corporate sector. They abandoned the smallest beautiful route. So now it's a time. We have to there's no need to reinvent. Bring back the smallest beautiful concept, household, homestead, women-based, soft kind of development that should take place. So I will conclude. Now that we are speaking, we are now doing it practically in my district, Kanyakumari district. Fortunately, it is blessed with resources. We have 5 different kind of resources which we are planning to use it as catalyst. On the coastal side, we have excellent fish, high quality, fairly good quality of fish. Value addition is almost not even 5%. We want to bring forth huge amount of value addition, thereby employing large number of people, converting youngsters into entrepreneurs and employing people. That is fish. Second is coconut. Our district and neighboring district is one of the top in the country as far as coconut is concerned. Coconut is a Kalpavriksh. Large number of products can be brought out of it. All are excellent products. So we should bring that coconut into this format and create an economy for coconut which can generate a lot of entrepreneurs and create a lot of jobs. Third is fruits. Again, Kanyakumari district and neighboring districts are very good in fruits, particularly banana and many varieties of fruits. And honey.
Yeah.
Fruits. And honey is next. Fruits. So based on fruits, we want to create an economy. Today, value addition is almost nil. We have to improve the value addition and create generation and entrepreneurship. Fourth is honey and herbal. Herbal and honey. Now, with the COVID, alternative medicine becoming very, very important, at least for preventive purposes. So, alternative medicine, Siddha, Ayurveda is gaining importance. There is huge potential for herbal and honey. And fifth is, we have this rubber. So, these all districts may not have, regions may not have this kind of resources, but the regions have distinct resources of their own. Or you can go across to a nearby place, not far away, maybe 100 miles or so. So, but basically what I am saying is resource-based, democratic, decentralized distribution system of development. Now, why I am saying it will be the basis for 60% economy? Because the way the country is being run now, it is not being run by our elected representatives. Don't be under any wrong illusion. The country is not run by our elected representatives. They are nothing but dummies. It is by run, I call it Davos Darbar. Earlier it used to be Delhi Darbar. Now it is Davos Darbar, which combines Washington and Delhi.
Yeah.
So now, unless we adopt this model of development, here I think, as mentioned by one of these speakers, I forgot, he has sent a note. Lot of local initiatives are taking place.
Yes.
Fantastic.
We'll
Very
get
successful.
Bring them all
together and create an alternative economy. That is the only way I think we can transform the political economy of this country. I'll be willing to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Devasahayam. I'm sorry, because I'm just trying to monitor the time also. We will discuss this issue of how to combine the local economy, the local alternatives into a broader vision in the question section. So let's move right away to the next speaker, to Aseem. Please, Aseem, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shalmali. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers and in particular Vijayan and Shalmali for putting in all the extraordinary hard work it would have taken to put this together. I've given a title to my talk. Actually, I've given 3 titles to my talk, which I'd like to share with you because I think it'll give you a flavor of how mad I'm becoming nowadays. So the first one is the wonderful imperative of Prakritik Swaraj, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The second title is a national freedom movement for ruralization, which I think Medha and Devasahayam have elaborated on quite a bit already. Or you could think of my talk as how to be a good Hindu. There aren't many left, certainly not in office today. None of them I take seriously as a Hindu. I'd like to begin by actually sharing with you one of my favorite kalams from one of my favorite poets, Nazir Banarsi. And he says in a ghazal, "Koi la sako to lautao mera wo hasi zamana, जिसे हमने कुछ न समझा, जिसे हमने कुछ न जाना, मुझे गम नहीं है इसका कि बदल गया ज़माना, मेरे ज़िंदगी के मालिक कहीं तुम बदल न जाना." So that's how I feel nowadays. The suffering of our people is epic, of our working people is epic. There are only two kinds of people in India today, those who are locked down and those who are locked up. A question for all of us to answer is this. Would this have happened if there was a COVID-18? Repeat, would what we are living through right now have happened if there was a COVID-18, which is to say, all other things being the same, you can see I'm trained as an economist, all other things being the same, if in the middle of March 2019, the news had come that President Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson were locking down their economies, would our Prime Minister have followed suit? With an election coming up in May 2019? I don't credit him with that much courage, no, nor with that much foolishness. So he has displayed his cowardice aplenty by actually showing his true colors of political gluttony, taking for granted the 352 seats he got to actually protect the world's rich against India's poor. That's what our Prime Minister has done, and we have to hold him to the lamppost on this. What makes our working people migrants but not us? Me, I came to Delhi in 1978. I'm not a migrant. I migrated to America in 1987. I returned in 1996. I migrated again to Norway in 2001. I returned in 2006. I come and go as I please. I'm not a migrant. But the people who put this house, this palace in which we live, this city together, they are migrants. That's a hell of a dictionary that they use. Our Prime Minister and our Gruh Mantri are from Gujarat. They don't belong to Delhi. When they speak about Ghar Wapasi, how come they continue to live in Delhi? Who gave them their homes here? So we have to ask some very basic elementary questions. Medha Tai has spent her whole life defending people who are constantly being pushed out of their homes, pushed out of the jungles, losing their rivers and their land. What if somebody found oil under Rashtrapati Bhavan? What if somebody found gold under 7 RCR? Would we ask our President and Prime Minister to move as easily? So our working people are suffering the collateral damage of the corona lockdown. It is as though the step was taken to precisely feed them to the viruses. And in a year in which the political dispensation of the day can afford to do it. Okay? This is cowardice, it has to be stated. Now, it's very difficult to watch television, as you know, nowadays. I don't own a television set, but I'm living with my parents, so I do watch some television at night. And in particular, I always watch Ravish's primetime show with them, one of the few honest voices on the screen. So many workers have said repeatedly on our TV screen that they are not returning to the city now. Just last night on BBC through NDTV, they were saying the same thing. They're not returning to the city. Have any of us ever heard this before in 73 years? I don't recall in my 57 years having ever heard this. And this is deeply saddening. And at the same time, I can see Gandhiji smiling sadly through the cracks of the edifice of the globalizing metropolitan economy. Why he would be sad, of course, for the same reasons we are sad, but he would also smile because he would sniff the possibility, as some of us are beginning to, of Gram Swaraj in the not so distant future. You know, wise man's wisdom is not proved by the years or the decades. Sometimes it takes centuries. So when Gandhi was talking about all this 110 years ago with Nehru, and Nehru was dismissing him all the way till 1945, finally, when he dismissed him once and for all, I always say the Congress assassinated Gandhiji before the RSS did. Nobody really took him seriously. And George Bernard Shaw saying at Gandhiji's assassination that goodness is dangerous. We need to bear that in mind. I have about 10 points to make. I hope I'll have time to go through all of them with you. And I don't want to be a Formula One driver while doing it. The first point. The corona crisis reveals the explosive fragility of the globalized development model the country, in emulation of the mighty West, has practiced since Nehru. It's not just about what has been happening since 2014. It's not just what has been happening since 1991. It's not just what has been happening since Garibi Hatao in 1971. It's been happening all the way since 1947. We've been on the wrong road. We've been on the wrong road so long that we've forgotten. First point. Second point, the perilous failings of this model: ecological devastation, vanishing communities and livelihoods, unsustainable urbanization from forced or induced migration, vulnerability to financial and biological pandemics, deadly comparative militarization of entire societies. You have conceived, COVID as a war as well around the world. These are not coincidental things. They emanate predictably from the fundamental drivers of the global system, not just India, right? What is the global system? For want of a better word, I'll call it modernity. But basically, it's a comparative corporate nationalism which is driven by a remorseless will to power on all sides. We would rather cut open our stomachs than come second in a race. That's what it is. It's about winning being the only thing. Not everything, but the only thing, as the American baseball coach says. So what we understand as development is merely the outer manifestation of this overwhelming drive for power, which the white man and the rest following him have displayed since Columbus and Vasco, since the 1490s. So development has always been a colonial idea. Here I want to sharply disagree 180 degrees from Amartya Sen and say development as war is a much better metaphor than development as freedom, which is a lie. So it's always been a colonial idea since 1941, 1944, since the Atlantic Charter and the setting up of the World Bank, which used to be called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, right? Reconstruction of Europe, development of the Third World. How dare you not develop? You're underdeveloped. Who taught us to think like this? First the English and then the Americans. Let's ask our Vikas Purush, in exactly which scripture of which Upanishad does development carry such high marks? Let's ask our Vikas Purush Prime Minister, how many times does the word development appear in the Constitution of India? Twice. One of them is mentioned by Medha when she mentioned Article 243. The other is Article 38. There's no other place. Economic growth conspicuous by its absence, from which I conclude one of two things. Either are the people who fought for our freedom were not patriotic enough, or we've lost our way. And you can make up your mind as to which one is the right answer. Point number 3. When you're woefully lost in a forest and you're unwilling to take radically fresh bearings from reliable stars, nothing you will do will come out right. Every move is the wrong move from the wrong place. You should not have been in this place in the first place. How did you get here is the question, right? The call of the hour is therefore to subject a whole way of life and thought to dispassionate scrutiny. It should be unsentimental, it should be fearless, and it has to be re-examining the way we've been living for 3 generations without getting personal with anybody, but we have to subject ourselves. And I've always lived in palaces, so I know what I'm talking about here. Before we imagine a new path through the woods. Moreover, being in the woods is not as bad a thing as is made out to be the case by supposedly civilized societies. This is very important. Which brings me to point number 4. Rabindranath Tagore, in book after book, lecture upon lecture, always maintained that there was a fundamental cultural and ecological difference between India and the West. India was always what he called Aranya Sanskriti, right? The culture of the forest, the religion of the forest, the message of the forest, his famous essay. The West measured progress in terms of the distance that modern man had taken from the jungles. Exactly the opposite. Hence, Tagore's final disillusionment against modernity, his last testament, what is called Shobhita Shankat in Bangla, Civilization, A Crisis in Civilization, August 1941, radio recording. So that's very, very important to understand. Like Devasahayam ji was saying, I'm also trained as an economist, and the only thing correct about GDP is its first adjective. It is gross. Gross domestic product. completely nonsensical notion which arose essentially between the wars, when Western nations decided that the only way to measure growth and development was this. And the reason was because when you're fighting a war, you want to know who can make more missiles and more rockets and more planes faster than the other. So you're measuring a civilian economy all the time on military criteria. That's what the GDP does. And nobody, not a single economics textbook is going to tell you this, right? They're all lies anyway, economics textbooks. Point number 5, when he put a question mark on modernity itself, his word was modern civilization. This is just what Gandhi was trying to say as far back as in 1909. So in Hind Swaraj, Gandhiji writes, I'm quoting now, "It is my deliberate opinion that India is being ground down, not under the English heel, but under that of modern civilization. It is groaning under the monster's terrible weight. There is yet time to escape it, but every day makes it more and more difficult," unquote. So this is when the train is entering the tunnel, and Gandhiji is noticing that it's entering the tunnel and it's deadly dark inside. And the deeper you enter this tunnel, the harder it will be to get out or to backtrack. So now that the monster has provoked a tiny invisible enemy, which has become the real or imagined torment of all humanity, I think it's time to look at Swaraj as a real possibility. It is as though Gandhiji knew just what was coming when he wrote in the same book, and I quote again, "There are now diseases of which people never dreamt before." Right? There are now diseases of which people never dreamt before. There are some 200 illegal chemicals in the body of every US president in recent times, according to my friend Nityanand Jayaraman, right? So that's the extent of irrationality of the modern project. Number 6. So he says, after diagnosing, all the sort of terminal ailments of modernity in his manifesto in Hind Swaraj, which I think is the best manifesto of civilizational recovery that exists, Gandhiji then proceeds to awaken optimism in his reader. And what does he say? He says, "Do not consider this Swaraj to be like a dream." I'll repeat that because I'm banished from seminar rooms because of this sort of belief. He says, "Do not consider this Swaraj to be like a dream." Right? It's not at all unrealistic. And remember, Gandhi is a practical genius. He's not, at all impractical. Everything Gandhiji did in his life was very practical. So now all the real stories that Ashish is going to share after me, and that Medha and Devasahayam have been talking about, the real stories that Vikalp Sangam and other great initiatives are assiduously documenting at the moment, are essentially a vindication of Gandhi's faith in the realizability of Swaraj. He thought Swaraj was much more possible than democracy. He thought democracy is dangerous because democracy gives you the illusion of freedom. He says in Hind Swaraj, parliaments are emblems of slavery. Again, I repeat, parliaments are emblems of slavery. He knew what he was talking about. He was basing his judgment on the English experience already. Point number 7. What stands in the way of the full realization of Swaraj? If it's so realizable, what stands in the way? The answer is very simple. It's the impossible dream of development, which is not allowing the dream of Swaraj to be realized. We argued this, Ashish and I have argued this in the book, in Churning the Earth, 8 years back. And as we said then, between the impossible and the supposedly unrealistic, we pick the latter, right? We argue, I personally believe development is as impossible as it is inevitable. It's impossible in the sense that it's ecologically impossible. It's inevitable because global cloud elites can't think of any kind of life beyond the kind of life development and progress would ensure to. Point number 8, to realize Swaraj today, it would have to be ecologically sound. So we need to speak of what I call Prakritik Swaraj. It is the only authentic alternative to a globally digitized corpocracy. This is entirely my term, so I can explain it in the discussion time. A globally digitized corpocracy, a global biototalitarian system that some people euphemistically refer to as surveillance capitalism, which I do think is still a euphemism. The three founding principles of Prakritik Swaraj would address the three disturbed ecologies of existence today. They entail the following, and these are my last 3 points. Number one, natural or cosmic ecology. First and foremost, a faithful reverence for all beings alive, including not only animals, but birds and fish, rodents and reptiles, insects and microorganisms, plants and trees, even oceans and mountains, rivers and rocks, the biosphere and the atmosphere, the sky and the cosmos it represents. To a true Hindu, this is the actual meaning of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. He doesn't go around with a rifle looking for the virus. That's not a Hindu. That's some other species. Even ants, and yes, viruses too have to be fed. That's what I learned from both my grandmothers, both devout Hindus. This requires ecological maturity, which presumes ecological balance, impossible under the dispensations of the globalized juggernaut. It demands of all humanity a renewal of a cosmology of what I call anthropo-responsiveness. Anthropo-responsiveness rather than anthropocentrism. Humanity can truly find its freedom not by selfishly appropriating and destroying the natural world, but only by respectfully turning the vast household of nature into an aesthetically beautiful, spiritually alive and abundant herbarium, not a hospital. This is at the heart of Prakritik Swaraj. This is natural ecology, with the cosmos aware, alive and aware to us. It restores health and beauty to our relationship to the rest of the natural world. Respect, the second point is cultural ecology. Respect for the conditions on which life is given to humanity. This includes the reverence referred to above, but it also implies respect for the imperative of community living. As social animals, we cannot be forced to live atomized lives before insensate screens indefinitely. Digital is not the new gravity. Lockdown is not the new normal. It is at best a temporary evil, at worst the dream of biototalitarians who thrive on human mass paranoia. This cusp must be negotiated not by building more airports or ordering more fancy military hardware from wealthy countries, or sending mining expeditions to the moon, as President Trump has recently done. By the way, he signed an order for it. It has to be negotiated by maturely accepting the terms on which Providence has granted life to humanity. This involves not so much new social contracts, which ultimately never survive anywhere except on paper. This entails an awakening, which is at once ecological, cultural, and spiritual. Among other things, it implies an embrace of our responsibilities to each other as members of the same human and natural families, without making an enemy even of viruses. This is cultural ecology. It restores health and beauty to our relationship to each other and to the wider human family and community. And lastly, spiritual ecology. So Prakritik Swaraj entails a personal spiritual transmutation. To Gandhiji, the recognition of the responsibility of duty was the very essence of freedom. It was dharma, the unity of the divine and the cosmic orders in the order of the human soul, that is to say the Atma, is the original meaning of dharma. My freedom does not lie in expanding my choices at the expenses of others. That is power, not freedom. My freedom lies in expanding your choices. Likewise, your freedom consists in expanding the choices of those others than yourself. Gandhi was no liberal, as you can see. This to Gandhi was Sarvodaya, the route to Swaraj, not the greatest good of the greatest number, as utilitarian economists think, but the shared awakening of one and all. Without this, humanity finds life endlessly meaningless, a blind pursuit of its selfish desires, leading ultimately to a world we are all too familiar with from pre-COVID days, and that has left us now at the mercy of an invisible microorganism. The way to heal the self is simple. It involves the permanent practice of love. It can no longer be postponed. This is personal spiritual ecology. It restores health and beauty to our inner relationship to ourselves. We are redeemed by living for many others and ultimately for everyone. In this, we realize ourselves by realizing the one. Something much greater than Bharat Mata Ki Jai is Dharti Mata Ki Jai. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Aseem, and my apologies. It's hard to manage the time when with all the important points that everybody is making and Thank you very much for that brilliant presentation. Let's go on to Ashish now.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I will try and avoid some of the, I will try and avoid repeating some of what my three predecessors have spoken. There will be some amount of overlap because I think it's important also to re-emphasize some of the points that have been made. I would like to start with asking four basic questions. Just going back, let's say, to the drawing table. First, what do we mean by economy? Is it only that which enters the financial accounts, only that which is financially quantifiable? Or is it also, for instance, a small farmer self-provisioning, feeding himself or herself? Is it also, for instance, as Devasahayam ji said, the care economy that women play such an important role in, which never gets into the GDP accounting and so on? Second, who takes decisions with regard to the economy? Is it the producers? Is it those of us who are consumers? Or is it a whole bunch of other people who are actually not really in the production economy? Medha Tai made that point very well. So who's taking the decisions? Third, what is the relationship between economy and ecology? Aseem brought this out very well. And it's very useful to point out right now to the origins of words. We often tend to forget that. Both economy and ecology come from the word oikos, the Greek word oikos, which means home. Now, how do we, economy is the management of home, ecology is the understanding of home. How is it that these two have been separated? How can we actually manage our home unless we understand it first? So should not the economy be within the ecological sphere? And in that also we then start asking questions about who owns this home, who owns the earth, who owns nature. These are very critical questions to ask ourselves if you're looking for fundamental transformations. Fourth question, what is the notion of progress? As Aseem very rightly pointed out, development is today violence. We have, in the last few decades, all of us have gotten to this notion that progress, development, wealth is this unilinear, one-directional change from being farmers and pastoralists and fishers and craftspersons and so on to being digital bodies and souls and selves. This notion that there is an underdeveloped or undeveloped and then the developed. This notion that there is a primitive and traditional and then a modern, and that these are all progressive transformations that need to take place, which is why, for instance, millions of the younger generation in the primary sector that we all are talking about do not actually want to stay on in the primary sector, partly because of the fact that they are suffering, but also partly because spiritually and mentally, those are no longer things that are of value. They are no longer things that we would want to do. And that includes a lot of us, people like me, for instance, who have shifted into a city and are doing other kinds of things. And I call this kind of transformation that has taken place with these four questions, the shift from livelihoods, which are really not jobs. Their livelihoods are about occupations that are connected to culture, to the environment, to the earth, to our social relationships. We've shifted from that to thinking of jobs as 9 to 5 and then waiting desperately for the weekend to enjoy ourselves. And I call that shift from livelihoods to deadlihoods. Whether you're in the traditional sectors or you're in the modern sector where you're sitting on your computer the whole day long and working in what are mostly soul deadening jobs. So how do we shift away from back into livelihoods for all of us, not just for the 60% that Devasahayam ji talked about? I would like to now show a few examples of where people are doing exactly this and then what we can learn from these examples. I'm going to try and share my screen so that I can show you a few examples of places that I have been lucky enough to be involved with or understand. So the first one, and to me, one of the most inspiring in the last 30 years of the work I've been doing. Can you all see the images on the screen?
Yes, we can. At
Okay.
least I can.
Okay, so this is 3,000 Dalit women farmers in Telangana who were in an extremely desperate situation 30 years back, as many most Dalit families across the country are, both in terms of the economic marginalization and also the social exploitation and marginalization and so on, including with patriarchy and casteism. In these last 30 years, going back to their traditional seeds, going back to their traditional seeds, especially focusing on millets and dryland farming, these women have created an incredible agricultural revolution. From a situation of hunger, they've actually moved not just into food security, but food sovereignty, which means complete local collective control over seeds, over land, over water, and over the knowledge with relationship to land and agriculture. They consider the earth and the land and the seeds as sacred, going back to Aseem's spiritual ecology concept. And through this, the collectivization of farming operations, through sharing their seeds and knowledge and so on, through creating grain banks in each of these villages, through a local PDS system, which is parallel to the public distribution, the government's public distribution system, through linking with consumers in Zahirabad and Hyderabad and so on, they've actually managed to create this kind of incredible agricultural revolution. What I think is very important here is, and I'll come back to this later, is that for them, the seeds and the land and so on are not privately owned. They're part of the commons. They're freely exchanged and shared. They do not believe in the patenting and the intellectual property rights of on seeds and so on. They believe that these are part of the commons. But also that culture is very important. They celebrate every religious function. They might be Hindus, but they will celebrate Eid, they will celebrate Christmas, they will celebrate all the religious functions, and are able to then show how these are so integrally connected. Very interestingly, from being a situation of hunger themselves, they are now in fact feeding landless people as part of the COVID relief package. They're giving 1,000 glasses of millet porridge to municipal workers, health workers, and police workers in Zahirabad town. The second example I want to give is from a large number of villages in central India, in eastern Maharashtra, in the districts of Gadchiroli and Amravati and so on, which have managed to claim back their collective rights to the forests, which were taken away during colonial time and even post-independence was in centralized control of the forest department. They have managed to claim it back using the Forest Rights Act. And through the process of collectivization, through opposing the destruction of forests, for instance, for mining, such as this, the 90 villages getting together in a Koorchi Mahagram Sabha in Gadchiroli, and through enabling their own sustainable harvesting of forest produce, they have actually collected not just revenues for each of the families in these villages, but also village revenues. And that is actually now being used for relief work, for where workers who had gone out have come back to the villages and don't have enough to feed themselves. It is these village funds that are being used for being able to help them to cope with this current crisis. One of the most inspiring examples of this, which many of us know of, is the village of Medha, which 35 years back declared that in our village, we are the government. We are the ones who will take decisions, and the forests will be managed as a commons. But not just that, they've also recently transformed their entire village, including all the agricultural land, from being private to commonly held. It's all part of the commons, and I'll come back to that as part of the lessons. A third example I want to give is from Kutch, from the sector of crafts. All over India, crafts have been marginalized. They have been destroyed because of the kind of industrialization policies and GST and all kinds of stuff that the government has imposed. In Kutch, handloom weaving has actually made an incredible revival because of a whole lot of innovations and so on. And what that has managed to do is to bring young people back into their homes, into weaving, including people who had gone off to work in Adani factory or Tata factory or gone off to the Gulf. Many of them have come back, and young women are actually turning to expressing their creativity by doing handloom weaving. So there's a reverse migration, in fact, that is taking place from urban areas, industrial areas into villages. And what's very important here is that it's not just because of the economy of the revival of handlooms, but also because they feel a pride in their own heritage of crafts. They feel the creativity of being able to do these jobs. They feel the need to be and the pleasure of being at home with their family while they're doing it, and that they're their own boss. They're not in somebody else's, their time is not in somebody else's control. You can take another similar example from Kutambakkam in near Chennai, where the ex-Dalit Sarpanch Elango has managed to create lots of local small-scale industrial occupations, so that families from there don't have to migrate to Chennai for work. They can actually be doing dignified work in their own villages, the kind of thing that Devasahayam ji spoke about. Now, and there are hundreds of more examples of this. You can look them up on our website, vikalpsangam.org, which actually have shown the potential for doing this kind of thing. Let me see if I can then put all of this together into some kind of what I think are the sort of lessons that one can learn from these sorts of examples, and also respond to one of the most important questions that people raise is, how do all these scattered initiatives across the country manage to come together and create the macro change that is needed? I don't think any of us has full answers to that, but I can give a few thoughts. And by the way, I also wanted to mention, because the examples I've given are mostly rural areas, there are also similar transformations taking place in urban areas, though less so than in rural areas. I think villages still have a sense of collective and community, which has been lost a lot in cities, and there's a lesson in it in there itself. So, what's the larger picture that's emerging in terms of the transformations we need? First, economic democratization, which means that producers need to be in control of the means of production, whether it is forest dwellers in forests or farmers over farms, or industrial workers over the industrial production, or craftspeople over the crafts, and so on. And economic democracy also then means that those of us who are, I mean, everybody's a consumer, but as consumers, what control do we have over what we are consuming in terms of how safe is it for us? How can it actually benefit not just us as consumers, but also those who are producing it? That kind of democratization is absolutely necessary, which then means collective rights over the resources, over the commons that are so crucial for our production systems. Second, the localization of exchange. Economic globalization, as many of my predecessors have said, has created this crazy economy in which for my basic needs, I have to depend on somebody 3,000 kilometers away. It makes absolutely no sense. Elango, who I spoke about just earlier with regard to Kutumbakkam's transformation, talks about what he calls the network economy, which is that a cluster of 20 villages, for instance, or 15 villages in a town can be self-reliant, at least for all basic needs. There is no need for them to be reliant for basic needs. I'm talking about water, food, housing, education, health, within that cluster of self-economy. And that's very much the Gandhian model, or maybe even what Marx meant with communism in terms of the withering away of the state and communities being in control. The third is the recognition of the care economy. The fact that so many people, so many millions and millions of women, of grandparents looking after grandchildren, and so on and so forth, is actually also very much part, and in fact a much greater part and much more important part of the economy, as much as the financial part is. Fourth, rural revitalization, and many have spoken, so I won't go into it in detail, but a very, very high priority to the primary sector, but also the secondary and tertiary sectors being in villages. There's no reason why, for instance, we have this divide about cities being tertiary sector and secondary sector, whereas the villages are primary sector. You can actually have a continuum across all settlements where different kinds of sectors can be playing a role. One of the things we've forgotten in our development model is not just neglecting agriculture and pastoralism and fisheries and forestry and so on, but also neglecting crafts. A recent estimate suggests that handicrafts, handlooms, etc., could have been employing and might still be able to employ something like 200 million people, the second biggest employer and livelihoods generator to agriculture. But that's been totally marginalized, as I said earlier. So bringing all of that back, and it's very much possible looking at the examples we already have, which means also that we have to stop the large-scale corporate sector from entering into these. In fact, I say we should stop the large-scale corporate sector altogether, but certainly at least in the sectors which are very eminently possible and feasible by the small-scale sector within small towns, within villages, within urban communities, and so on. Fifth, producer collectives and cooperatives. I don't know if anybody's spoken about that yet. But again, there are hundreds of examples of where producer cooperatives, not the kind of cooperatives set up a government, but where producers themselves are setting them up in democratic ways with benefits being equitably shared by all of them, etc. I believe that producer collectives can actually manage virtually the entire economy from production to retail to distribution and everything. There is no need for the Reliances and the Tatas and so on for doing that kind of stuff. Sixth, commoning. We have to challenge private property. And by this, I include things like inheritance. This is a very controversial subject, but why should I be inheriting my parents' wealth? Can it not be public wealth? And at least if one doesn't go to that direction, at least in terms of nature, land, water, knowledge has to be in the commons. And I emphasize knowledge here because the privatization of knowledge is as much of a problem as the privatization of nature and natural resources is. Seventh, what sorts of indicators do we use for progress and development? GDP is completely broken. It is not just faulty, it's a dangerous way of looking at progress. Can we look at it in terms of well-being? Does everybody have safe water? Does everybody have clean air? Does everybody have nutritious food, etc.? That kind of indicators of well-being, not quantified, but much more in terms of qualitative indicators. Can those be looked at? And there are many examples of where, in fact, countries like Bhutan have tried it out with all kinds of faults, but nevertheless, and in fact, New Zealand has moved into it. Why can't India also go in that direction? But we have to be able to show the way. Eighth, a sustainable consumption line. Medha spoke about Amiri Rekha, and this is related to that. There has to be a line above which nobody can consume, whether it's energy or water or minerals or whatever it is. I'm not saying that the government makes this and then imposes it on us. This is a social revolution that has to take place where, in fact, it's not neighbors' ownership and, somebody's ownership and neighbors' envy, but somebody's simplicity and neighbors' envy that we actually start talking about. So can we have a sustainable consumption line? Ninth and last, reinserting ourselves within nature. Aseem has already spoken, and I'll just go a little bit deeper into that, which means that we respect not just each other's rights, but also the rights of other species, the rights of rivers, the rights of everything around us, and understanding that, in fact, it's not just, but everything might have a spirit or might have a soul. Let's try and respect that. And I think these 8 or 9 kinds of transformations that we need are eminently possible, already happening in thousands of examples around the world. Let me end by talking about just how do we bring this together? How do we make the macro change? I think we have to put together what Medha said, which is Sangharsh and Nirman. The resistance to the currently dominant economy and polity and so on, which means we resist, we boycott, we stop so-called development projects, etc., which many movements are doing, along with the reconstruction, the alternatives of the kind that many of us have spoken about. The intersection between the different spheres of life that is so very important, what I call radical ecological democracy. Aseem says Prakritik Swaraj, Eco Swaraj. I mean, there are different terms. You can pick your own term that you want. But essentially what we're talking about, and I'm going to share my last slide here, is, let's see if I can get it up. I've lost it somewhere, doesn't matter. But basically saying that we have to be able to integrate this kind of transformation that we're talking about of the economy with also the here it is, if you can see it. So we've talked about economic democracy, we've talked about radical political democracy, which means Swaraj at the level of villages, at the level of urban neighborhoods and so on, where most decision making takes place at the local level. What Medha, for instance, said, कि हमारे गांव में या हमारे कस्बे में हम ही सरकार, even as we make the state accountable for what it should be doing. Third, on the bottom right-hand side, the struggles for social justice, because localization can be extremely dangerous if it remains casteist and gender inequitable and so on. So all those struggles are part of it. Fourth, culture, so very important. The diversity of cultures, what the Deccan Development Society, Dalit women have shown is the respect for all cultures, for languages. The loss of languages is another huge problem that we have right now. And celebrating creativity and thinking of knowledge, not just as modern science and technology, but all the diverse forms of knowledge that we have. And fifth, of course, unless we save the earth itself, we are all doomed, however rich or powerful or mighty we might be. So it's this intersection of these five that I think is so very important. And I think looking at the kinds of examples that we have, doing the networking of all these different examples, not just within India, but across the world, strengthening each other, being able to express solidarity when any of these initiatives is in danger, and of course, thinking of a collective vision or visions of what kind of a better world we want, has all to be part of the transitioning towards this kind of transformed society. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashish. Thank you once again to all the four speakers for brilliant, brilliant presentations. And now, oh goodness, we have so many questions, and comments and support things. One question which I think has already been addressed is this issue of, with thousands of localized initiatives models already there, what different measures do you suggest that these local economic models get priority? So, for example, mutually supported networking of localized economies and so on. But Ashish, you already, I think, have talked about the networking of localized alternatives, and you also talked about, which, in many cases, we talked about networked commons also, for example, And Devasahayam also talked about it, Aseem and Medha also talked about it. So there are other questions, many. One question, for example, is, can this crisis provide a new opportunity for a different type of urbanization? Everybody doesn't live, for example, only in rural areas. Many people now live in cities, but taking the point that all of you have talked about in terms of reviving the local economies from the primary sector point of view. What does this mean in terms of what do we do with this urban economy? So that's one question. Any of you can take it. Let me just read off a few questions, and then I can give you all around to respond to them. Another is, how do we create an Amiri line? How do we develop we know how much research, and which we may not accept, of course, and what resources were put into creating poverty line. Now, what do we do? How do we create a line or a limit on wealth concentration? How do we ensure that planning switches from top down to bottom up? We have talked about being important, right? But how do we make that switch happen, especially when we have a government on top, as MGD already explained, that this is a government from the Doha Darbar, with the Doha Darbar being so powerful in terms of capital, in terms of resources, in terms of global economy. How do we move from that to a non-Doha Darbar, which is the Swaraj-oriented local economies and localization? How do we make that switch? Okay, let me just, maybe these are already enough. Shall we take one round of responses from people? How do we change benchmarking? So many of you talked about benchmarking. We could change the paradigm. We have to change how we value wealth. How do we change these values? There's a social aspect of it, but there's also then the political and economic aspect of it. So why don't we go back to all the speakers again? Let me switch the order around a bit. Let's start with Aseem. Take whichever question you want, Aseem, and respond.
I'm going to try, because they're all very daunting questions. The first question about a new kind of urbanization, I'll refer all of us to what I think is the best essay and the most poorly read essay on the theme of urbanization, which is Rabindranath Tagore's right? So robbery of the soil is something Rabindranath writes in 1924, and it is meant to be a way to explain to his, fellow workers in Shantiniketan as to what has gone wrong in the relationship between town and country. It should be mandatory reading from class 9 onwards, but of course, like so many things mandatory, it doesn't happen. Now, what does Rabindranath say there? And I think the message is even more valid today than it was when he was writing it. He does not take the Ambedkarite view that there's something intrinsically wrong with villages. And by moving to cities, by urbanizing the world, you will liberate not only Dalits, but all humanity. Nor does he take the Gandhian view that by sending everybody back to villages, you will sort out the problems of humanity. He tries to say that this is a marriage in which divorce is not an option. The marriage of town and country has to be renegotiated on terms which are more balanced, more fair, more equitable, more ecological. The city cannot live without the countryside. And Rabindranath would like to believe, although sometimes in my bad disagree with him on this, he would like to believe that nor can the countryside live without the city. Well, history proves something else, that countryside has lived without the cities in large parts of the world. So empirically, there's an issue with that. But let's go along, and then you need to renegotiate this relationship. So otherwise, the mind is trapped in a binary. The city is evil or the village is evil. And both are huge simplifications of reality, in my opinion. So a new kind of urbanization, yes, but how does that happen without a new kind of respect for villages? How does that happen without ruralization of a new kind, without understanding the ecological and cultural debt which the cities owe to the villages? Ask yourself, how many languages has modernity invented in 5 centuries? The answer is probably close to 0. Except computer languages, and ask yourself how many languages modernity has destroyed, what Ashish was pointing to a few minutes back, and the number goes into thousands. So the cultural debt that modernity, metropolitan areas of the world owe to the countryside is humongous. If there was time, I'll tell you stories about Norway and what I learned about onomatopoeia and language learning from birds and animals and so on. So there is a huge issue here because the metropolitan bias, which affects the best of minds, and I've already named Amartya Sen. I don't mind naming him again because he's the patron saint for so many when it comes to development. The metropolitan mind cannot see any virtue in learning anything from villages. So unless a respect for villages resumes, and unless we respect the village within ourselves, the bumpkins within ourselves, because each of us does have that still in India. It's one of the few cultures in the world which still has large rural communities, 800 million people still dependent on farming. This is historic, and it's not going to change. So we need to think of it in a much larger context. You can't just answer the question of a new kind of urbanization without bringing in ruralization, without bringing in agriculture, forestry, pastoral livelihoods, a whole set of things, and a revaluation of the way economies are valued. Why is it that farmers around the world, not just in India, have been starving for eons? Why? Because the terms of trade were put against agriculture in societies, both capitalist and communist, for 2 and more centuries. Okay. I could go on with this, but that's as much as I'll say now and not take more time. I don't think I should take more time. I can go into the other questions, but I think other speakers should speak.
Thank you very much, Aseem. So who would like to, Devasahayam, can we go to you, Mr. Devasahayam? Hello, are you there? Yes. Please give us some, there are a number of questions, for example, about changing the benchmarking and system. Please take whichever you want.
I'll just stop. No, this urban is very important because I am also one of those areas. Urban is one of my specialized areas. Now, urbanization, rather the urban sprawl will be arrested post-COVID. There will not be that kind of urban rush and urban sprawl. So urban cities will have a breathing space. What do you do during this breathing space? Now, over the last 2 decades or so, urban development has virtually become urban real estate. Real estate contractors have been running riot, and with all kind of violations, urban centers have become a dangerous place to live. You know, the kind of natural calamities, flood and other things. I don't want to go into detail, but the fact remains that there will be a paradigm change as far as urbanization is concerned. Now, how do we redo the urban scenario now? Informal sector constitutes 75% of urban India. Now, informal sector is untouchable now. That is one of the things I was mentioning earlier, that you think that they are unwanted people, but they make you live. Now, informal sector need to be mainstreamed. How do we do that? I can't explain that in a few minutes. It's a very long. You have to spread out the functioning of the commercial informal sector activities, small activities, instead of large commercial centers, large industries. So one of the areas that which you can solve the urban system is the mainstream of the informal sector. Third is enforcement of the rules and regulations stringently. Now, too much of corruption is taking place in urban development. So these are the 3-4 areas we can tell. Now, coming to the organizational, how do we make it happen? Now, making it happen is the most critical thing of all this, where a specific point was mentioned that how under a command and control economy, how can local initiatives take place and prosper. Model that we are trying to develop in Kanyakumari is very, very simple. We do not want to depend upon government at all. Initiative will be taken by the people at the household level. They will initiate the activities. They will undertake the activities. Government will come on need-to basis only. Only when we need any help, any assistance from the government side, we will go to the government and make it happen. Otherwise, the economy that we are preparing, that's why we said a highly decentralized economy. For each product, we are planning an economy. It will all be home-centered, and almost all activities will be independent of the government. And independent of the government regulations also. Only where the government support is required, we will bring the government inside. That is the kind of economy that we must now do for the rural economy. If we depend upon the government, nothing is going to happen. I know, I have worked in government. Government people do not have that kind of imagination. So this is the second response I would like to have, which was the third one, where that.
One question, Mr. Devasahayam, which was very helpful if you had a response to, was this issue of what to do about democracy. Because as you yourself pointed out, the democracy has become, it's a numbers game. It's a joke that 25%, those elected by 25% claim a major mandate and are making these sweeping changes.
Now, to be very frank with you, if anyone calls India a democracy, he must be sent to a sanatorium. We are functioning on all the, and almost the entire, particularly, see, I have seen emergency days. Emergency was imposed, democracy was extinguished, people rose up in revolt, Jayaprakash Narayan was there, democracy was brought back, but the kind of political combination he brought back did not survive for long. Then the other group took over, they have been plundering it, the communal agenda, and through the communal agenda, they have come to power. Even then, I salute the people of India. 75% of Indian electorate did not vote for them. Let me be very clear. Even those who voted for them, there is huge suspicion as to whether they were genuine votes. I don't want to go into that. So as of now, what is happening is not democracy. Again, the only savior of democracy is the people of this country. Now, as Medha Patkar said, now you have been locked down. Now, I feel, I have a suspicion that they are using COVID as an excuse for locking down people, putting them in curfew so that they don't come out. They can continue with their autocratic totalitarian system. So now, at the end of the day, whatever you may say, nobody will come from outside or anywhere else. Only the people's rising and asserting, going back to the roots of democracy is the only way. There is no other shortcut.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Let me move to Medha. Medha, are you there?
Yeah.
Medha, which question would you like to respond to? One question that has come from you repeatedly is about the Ameri line.
About the?
Ameri line. about
Yes.
preventing, how do we start developing this
Yes.
idea and make it a real thing, and then organizing, please.
As Ashish has rightly said, that it is an absolutely fake vision that we only consider economy to be based on money or currency, and then the profit related to that. We must really develop value and respect for the land, water, forest, and the natural resources. How will that happen? I think just as the workers, the real producers, are not on record, uh, their contribution doesn't get really reflected in the GDP. Even the natural resources and their role and value is not reflected in any of the criteria of the present economy and its growth. Hence, I think and it's the parasitic existence of the urban communities on these resources of that are still alive, partly or fully, with the rural communities, that really, diffuses the real contribution and the resource matrix and the scenario, and then that gets reflected in the wrong kinds of valuation that bring in the disparity to a vulgar extent. So I think आत्मनिर्भर भारत की बात जो है वो कोई एक पॉलिटिकल स्लोगन ही रहेगी जब तक कि आत्मनिर्भर गांव, जिसका मतलब ही एक प्रकार से सेल्फ रिलायंट विलेज, गांव का स्वराज है, वो हम लोग नहीं अस्तित्व में लाएंगे. और दिस इज द टाइम एंड द वर्कर्स आर रिटर्निंग एंड आई हैव बीन टॉकिंग टू देम थ्रू आउट. मैं कल भी बात कर रही थी कि जो लोग आज वापस जा रहे हैं कानपुर या पलामू, उनके यहाँ या छत्तीसगढ़ में जो नेचुरल रिसोर्सेस है, those should be harnessed, and the new colonization which is still dependent on the raw material from the rural area and the final produce which is more valued, and that value addition takes place not in the rural locality itself but in the urban locality, that must be stopped. I think we must develop the different criteria of the village level, sort of vision and plans, and this is there. Montex in Ahluwalia also, with the the response from the working group of planning commission with Devki Jain and others of that time, had really written to the chief secretaries to give them the village development plans. Now Niti Ayog is seems to be with different initiative and different idea and goals, but still there are some kind of statements of Niti Ayog also. I think we must go to that kind of planning where the village level, the community level plans will be incorporated in the larger plans. And उसमें ये होना चाहिए for the self-reliance कि the basic needs should be fulfilled. As Ashish said, if not in one village, it can be a panchakroshi. It has to be a unit that will not be limited to the rivers and the hilly ranges which divides the states or the districts, but it should be a socio-economic, ecological unit. And all these three things, as Aseem Bhai has beautifully interlinked those, must be brought into not only deciding the unit of administration, but also the unit for planning. And that those plans should be the basic. Even district level planning, which was there in Kerala, or the George Fernandez pushed it from some time, I think it is necessary to really bring it back. And if the Panchayat Raj, even the local self-government people, which we cannot destroy everything at a time, but if they insist and assert their right, I think a long way we can go, not only through the PESA Act or the Forest Rights Act for the Adivasis, but also through the Article 243 and the overall framework of Panchayati Raj and community development that was developed till in the early 50s. So I think that is the basic thing, for which it is also necessary that the social activists must go back to the rural India. If we are on the continuum and we are living a different way, our background is different, I think we cannot convince and convey to people What Gandhi did was live and act the way you think. I think that is necessary. It's not only global thinking and local living kind of a thing. Another thing I want to just mention is uske liye jo alag-alag new institutions like Grain Bank of Telangana and other things. So first use the resources for fulfilling the need of that small unit, and then only it will go out. This kind of planning criteria must be brought in. And Amiri Rekha ki jo baat hai, मैंने कहा कि wealth tax or the heavy taxes on property is one thing, but the other thing is also acquisition of property. We are acquiring the land also of the small and the marginal farmers, and because the corporate houses also live on or produce with the natural resources from those communities without giving back the real share which they deserve, the workers as well as the landowners, the riverine populations, the forest dwellers, everyone is just one-sidedly contributing, and they are being exploited or acquisition karna hai, so we should acquire the unreal estates, as Devasahayam ji is saying, real estates, those unreal estates. And Sardar Patel ko hum yaad kar rahe aaj, so we should really be taking real steps. Now for this, actually suo moto intervention by the judiciary is expected. If they really respect and they have to follow the constitutional framework, that is not happening. We must raise our voice as the social cry, and that only will bring in the change. Otherwise, there is no possibility of this thing, of the change on its own.
Yes.
So, humse judiciary tak, everywhere we must raise a voice, within and outside.
Right. Thank you, Medha, because I would like to, there is a question that specifically would like Ashish also to respond to. So Ashish, where do the concepts of these localized networks and the issues that you were presenting and the strategies you were presenting, how do they fit with the concepts of degrowth?
Yeah.
You know, and others that are sort of the Green New Deal. There are all these ideas that have been flying around in the world. And of course, many of us Asians are not actually involved in those discourses. Where would you see whatever, you get my point.
I think one of the tragedies of our existence in the global south is that first we took all the wrong ideas from the global north on development and progress and so on and so forth. And now we are copying all the right ideas, right for them, but not necessarily for us. And for instance, everything that we talk about, I can see in the questions people are asking, oh, is this degrowth? It's not. Degrowth is an idea. I think it's a fantastic idea for economies and societies that have grown way too much in terms of material and energy consumption. And that includes maybe 50 million people in India or 100 million people in India, yes. But there are dozens or hundreds of concepts of that kind around the world. We've just brought out a book last year called Pluriverse, which has 100 examples of notions of well-being. They can be post-growth, they can be buen vivir, they can be Swaraj, they can be Ubuntu, they can be Kyosai, they can be Minobatsivin. There's hundreds of them of how people can actually live in harmony with the rest of nature and with each other without using growth as a means. And in fact, completely opposing growth because it does not lead to well-being. So let's take a look at this enormous diversity, including what's emerging from the South. Aseem spoke about Tagore, and there are so many thinkers, but not just thinkers at that intellectual level, but also thinkers from the ground. When I spoke about Medha Lekha, for instance, Devaji Tofa, who was young when this whole initiative started, one of the local Gonda Adivasis, he's as brilliant a mind and a practitioner as anybody else. But we tend to forget them. We tend to think only of the Marxes and the Gandhis and so on and so forth. There's so many hundreds which can inspire us. And I think that's also a crucial thing to understand about this urban-rural question. We have to get rid of this dichotomy. I already mentioned, for instance, that the dichotomy which says that urban is secondary and tertiary and rural is primary has to be gotten rid of. Let's take the example of the transformations taking place in Bhuj. It's a small town, but there are incredible lessons for all cities where they are saying that the pastoralism, the Maldharis that are in and around Bhuj are as much part of the urban economy as the industry or the services sector, right? They are trying to achieve, and this is a question also with regard to urban changes in urbanization, much more self-sufficiency even within the urban ecosystem. Why cannot we be almost 100% water self-sufficient in our cities? We can if we manage to store and in a decentralized way properly. 100% energy self-sufficient. A very significant amount of food self-sufficiency. Rajendra Ravi, who's on this call, had a whole series of webinar talks about urban agriculture, and we have so many incredible examples from around the world on that. So all of these, but this needs a very fundamental transformation in what we think of as a city and how we plan a city. How do we plan a city, for instance, for minimum mobility, where work and residents can be in a, more or less the same area, and so on and so forth. How can we plan a city primarily from the point of view of the most marginalized sections? How do they have a right to the city? How do they have a right to be planning and budgeting for the city? And there are many examples of where this is beginning to happen. But the other very important part of this, and I think Medha alluded to this, is the rights of villagers of rural India to say no. The rights of Devachi Urli outside Pune to say no to the dumping of our garbage into their village. The rights of anybody around our city to say no, we will not give our land for your urbanization and for you. We will not give our minerals for your this thing. We will not give our water for your thing. That kind of mobilization, which is both a people's mobilization most importantly, but also a policy shift. The Forest Rights Act in that sense is a policy shift because it enables communities to say it's our forest, we're not going to give it to you for mining. That will then create the dynamics in which city dwellers will have to start also asking themselves, what right do I have to deprive somebody else? And even if I don't ask myself that question, I'm not going to get that resource. So I will have to reorganize my life to make it much simpler and much less consumeristic. These are policy shifts, people's mobilization shifts, but also cultural shifts. I think the mindsets we have. I remember when I was growing up in school, we used to use our pencil to the, till it was down to like this much. We used to call it a Gandhi pencil. Beyond that, you couldn't write with it, but you would use it till that much. Today, I'll use things and then just throw them away. I'll use my cell phone for 6 months and then throw it away because a new one has come in. That cultural shift has happened in 1 or 2 generations of moving away from what we thought of as cool, that is simpler living, to what we think of now as cool, which is much more material possessions and so on. We can make that cultural shift happen again in 2 generations if we are able to actually create the right messaging, the right role models, etc. And all of us need to become that. So for instance, when we talk about Amiri Rekha or the sustainable consumption line that I spoke about, which is related to it, how much do we practice it ourselves even in our own institutions? Let's take our own NGOs. The one I work with, Kalpavriksh, recently took a decision that we will not have more than 1:2 or 1:3 salary difference. Can we all work with that? Can we demand that? Medha said 1:10. Can we even demand a 1:5? Can we demand a policy shift and we say nobody has a salary above X amount? Switzerland tried a referendum a few years back in which 48%, I think, or 47% of the population said, yes, there should be a salary limit to all corporate and government salaries. Unfortunately, they were defeated by the 52% because those 52% were scared of the fact that the corporate said, we'll leave Switzerland and go somewhere else if you do this. But we can create that kind of mass mobilization to actually say that this is ridiculous. Even some industrialists are actually beginning to say that the kind of inequalities that we have are absolutely abysmal. So I think it's a shift from personal lifestyles and cultural change to the larger policy and macro shifts that we will have to push through with people's movements. And I'm actually surprised, this is my last point here. I'm surprised that in India, we haven't taken to the streets against inequality as much as we should have. It's happening in South Africa, it's happening in Chile, it's happening across, even during COVID times, people are actually mobilizing on the streets in different ways, keeping safe physical distance. We haven't done that. We need to be able to show, I mean, I think we're too much fatalistic. I don't know what it is. There's something in the Indian psyche which doesn't enable that, except in localized situations against destructive projects. But at a mass scale, the kind of abysmal inequality and deprivation and so on that we have to be able to do this mass mobilization, even as we make our own personal shifts. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashish. I wanted to give all speakers 1 more minute for any last burning point, but I don't know if we have time. But is there any last burning point that any of you would like to say?
Yes, I have a point.
But sir, less than 1 minute, sir.
One minute, less than 1 minute. You see, almost all the institutions of democratic governance are collapsing or already collapsed. I talked about democracy, extreme centralization of power in Delhi, and that too in the Prime Minister's office is killing almost all institutions. Let me specifically mention, Parliament is not functioning as Parliament anymore. Supreme Court is not functioning as Supreme Court anymore. Election Commission is not functioning as Election Commission anymore. And center-state relations are of the lowest ebb. There's nothing known as federalism in this country. So what is happening is, in the garb of this disaster, a much worse disaster is taking place. That means India is being converted from a federal into a unitary state, with all institutions of democratic governance being subjugated, voluntarily or with terror. This is one area, and nobody can protect the people. Individuals come and go, but institutions are the only one which retain democracy, can save the people. I think we must start a movement. Medha Patkar, I think, must get away from the Narmada mindset and get into a national mindset, and launch a protest, launch agitation, launch a struggle to defend, to protect the institution of democratic governance, but for which I don't think any of the things that we have talked about today will be possible. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Devasahayam ji. Medha, any last burning point? 1 minute se kam, please. बोलिए. Medha, unmute please. Medha, आप mute पे हो.
Violence is the issue. Aseem has referred to the violence with nature, but the violence with the human beings that is all around us is not at all a part of any religion, and certainly is against not just constitutional but the human rights and human values. And I think we all must stand for non-violence, even in our modus operandi, in our change towards the new paradigm. How will we really come up with what kind of solutions and actions? That I think is the most important thing, because we cannot destroy everything at a time, but we should start with ourselves. And that violence which is against kind of certain communities, targeting them even during COVID-19, we must all of those, with appeal to all of those who are really religious people, who consider themselves as human beings, that they really should keep away. Another thing is towards the workers, who are called to be informal or unorganized, but they are exactly the opposite. They are the base of the whole economy, formal, informal, all kinds of economies, the diversity in the economies, and the discrimination among the economies is well pointed out. It is necessary that we start with ourselves. I will appeal to the women from the middle and upper class whose husbands or their own incomes are safe to really pay their domestic servants. Such kind of small actions we can start with, and not just talk about it. And the laws which are violated and amended, I think we must be openly criticizing all amendments which are against constitution, and we must join the so-called poor. They are rich in other resources, but they are called to be poor and kept to be poor. You join them as individuals in whatever way, with your pen and paper, or your intellect, or your action of sitting with them or walking with them for a few minutes. It is necessary that you really help them to get the laws which are good enough to give them rights and space implemented. And also let us follow the electoral reforms, as they are called, which would be revolutionary. I will not spell out those today, but we can have one kind of dialogue on that. Thank you so much for organizing.
Thank you, Medha. Let me go to Aseem. Aseem, any burning points? Aap mute pe ho.
No burning points. I'd just like to end with a little story, which my mother told me just after Babri Masjid had happened. And what happened was that Advani ji called Pandit Bhimsen Joshi to sing at Ayodhya. and पंडित जी ने जवाब दिया, यहाँ तो आपने पहले से सारे सुर खराब कर रखे हैं, मैं आके क्या गाऊंगा? Right? You've already spoiled all the music and the melody. What am I going to come and sing here? Now that is the register in which we have to speak to these cowards. We are too afraid. We are afraid of going to jail. We are afraid of getting beaten up by cops. And if he is going to arrest me for sedition, let him try. Let him try. Okay? Sedition was not written in the Vedas. Sedition is from British colonial law. And they're running a so-called post-colonial state. Colonialism never went anywhere. It's a very colonized state. And I think we need to wake up to that and show them up for what it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Aseem. It's very important to bring the political organizing and challenging aspect of building a different transformative world. Ashish, do you have any?
I think, I mean, of course, in full agreement with all the last comments that that have been made. I just maybe want to end with something that a lot of people ask, saying, okay, how do we replicate these initiatives elsewhere? And I think what's really, really crucial is both for transforming, for the kind of courageous resistance that we need, of what like Aseem just spoke about, and for doing the practical and visionary on-ground transformations. What we need really is a common set of values, of ethical principles. It's not about replicating a Deccan Development Society or a Medha Lekha or a Kutumbakam somewhere else. It's actually about saying, okay, what is it that's worked? It's solidarity and cooperation, not competitiveness. It's the ability to live simply and not want more and more material. It's non-violence in all sorts of ways, as Medha said, and not violent development and so on. It's it's interdependence and reciprocity, rather than saying, oh no, I'm my own individual and I'm going to use a selfie approach, right? It's rights, collective, but also responsibilities. Swaraj, as Aseem I think rightly pointed out, is about whatever I do has to enhance your abilities to do what you want to do. This is also the Ubuntu concept. Ubuntu is not a software. It's an ancient Southern African concept saying, I am because we are. I think it's this set of, and many more such ethical principles that kind of tie us together, bind us together. And anybody in the dominant system that actually suggests that or violates these sorts of ethical principles, we have to resist and we have to promote them, especially also in our education system. Our education is so incredibly faulty that it teaches all the wrong values. It teaches selfishness, competitiveness, how to become rich, how to become powerful, how to leave everybody else behind, rather than the kinds of values that these incredible initiatives are talking about. So let's also look at alternative learning and alternative education spaces. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. And in fact, when you brought up the point of concepts, I was just thinking, yes, we all our minds sort of think alike. What I was trying, I don't think I can do any kind of summarizing, but I just started putting down keywords and concepts that came from all your presentations and also from the chat box, you know. And just in terms of concepts, visionary concepts as well as practical organizing concepts, I have a list of at least 30. I won't read them all, but they range from localization, rebuilding economies from the ground up, direct people-to-people democracy, direct governance, spiritual ecology, both personal and collective, ecological, spiritual, economic Swaraj, the issue of resistance, the importance of resistance and organizing, food sovereignty, commons and commoning, the rebuilding of rural enterprises, non-violence, peace, the networking of local alternatives, networking of networked commons, the care economy, producers cooperatives, and conscientized consumption, you know, where we ourselves are conscientizing ourselves on that, removing away of colonial benchmarks and colonize, you know, language and standards that colonize ourselves, recognizing our own place in nature, respect for nature, and so on. So, issue of diversity, social, cultural knowledge, challenging the metropolitan bias. So, you know, developing balance between urban, rural, material, non-material, collective, spiritual, and so on. So I think there are a number of concepts and keywords, all of you have presented, which are both visionary as well as very, very practical and organizing. Of course, there are many, many keywords in relation to democracy and self-governance, but there are too many for me to summarize, so I won't even try because we have already gone a little bit above our webinar time. So I want to thank all the speakers. Thank you very, very much. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege and an honor to walk with you, to march with you, to fight with you, and to be in the same struggles as you. And I know that the struggles are going to be quite long, and they will continue on, and we will all be part of it one way or another. And I look forward to those. And thank you to all the participants, because we had more than 250 participants. And even now we have 200, and people would probably keep on talking. Who would stay if we organized another session like this? So clearly there are a lot of people who would like to continue this discussion with us.